All right, thanks, Amit. Very, very kind introduction. Thank you. So today's topic is going to be building Slack apps with Apex on Salesforce. And as Amit said, I'm Daniel Peter, Salesforce practice lead at Robots and Pencils, and also Salesforce MVP. So I just wanted to give a little background on Robots and Pencils and Slack and Salesforce because there's kind of an interesting triangle going on there. In fact, Robots and Pencils is very deep in the Slack ecosystem, uh, probably more deep than in the Salesforce ecosystem, actually. And one of the main reasons I joined Robots and Pencils in 2018 was because of this announcement. So Robots and Pencils created this product called Missions, and Slack acquired it. And that's what really made me take Robots and Pencils seriously. At that time, there was no talk of Salesforce buying Slack. So all of the Slack work that Robots and Pencils was doing was not part of Salesforce. It was traditional web developers building on AWS, and they were probably not even thinking too much about Salesforce. But all along, Robots and Pencils was doing a lot of this partner work, and Slack is a much newer company than Salesforce. So it wasn't long after they acquired Missions from Robots and Pencils, which ultimately became Workflow Builder for Slack. You've probably heard of Workflow Builder. But they also launched their partner program, and you can see the first partners they launched with, Robots and Pencils was like their number one partner. So there's a lot of history both on the product and the services side with Slack and Robots and Pencils. But then we got this announcement, right? Salesforce is acquiring Slack. And so at this point, this I think really popped up on the radar of a lot of Salesforce developers, definitely did for me. And I'm thinking, wow, Robots and Pencils is big Slack partner, and we've got this new Salesforce practice that I'm leading. What are these interesting things that are going to happen with Slack and Salesforce? So I started learning this. I started learning Slack, getting very interested in it. But I was curious if Slack could be, how palatable could it be for like a Salesforce developer, right? I've been building with things like Apex, Visual Force, Lightning Web Components for 13 years. What is it like to start building Slack apps? And in fact, can you use Salesforce as the back end for this? And so that's kind of the background and the context for my talk today. So as it turns out, Salesforce is a good platform for building many Slack apps on. You may even call it a great platform, but obviously we all know about the limitations of Salesforce, right? So governor limits and things like this. Those things might push you to use AWS as a backend instead, but I still say it's a good platform, and you can build many Slack apps on it. Not all, but many. And we'll get into how we can do that. But the other cool thing is, right, hopefully the folks on this call, you've been developing in Apex for a long time. You've got all the skill set in Apex. Can you build Slack apps with that knowledge that you already have, so without having to learn a lot of new concepts? And so I think there's a lot of transferable skills between all the stuff from developer.salesforce.com and api.slack.com. So the Slack and Salesforce development intersection, I think there's a lot of transferable skills there. So you're already halfway there. You've already won a lot of the battle just by being a Salesforce developer. But the two platforms, they definitely have some differences. This is a couple of the big ones I wanted to call out. So Salesforce has a database and Apex as well as all their REST APIs. Slack is just APIs, right? They're coming out with some new platforms now with database as a service and some application hosting, but that's kind of in pilot beta right now. So right now, all we really have are Slack APIs. So think about Salesforce. If all of it had was their web, REST APIs, that's kind of what it's like working with Slack. So that's kind of one of the major differences. But here is a long list of similarities, and this isn't exhaustive. But what I've kind of have put here is the Slack concept and the Salesforce equivalent after it. So Slack has a web API, which is kind of analogous to the Salesforce REST API. Slack has these bots, which are kind of like a service account in Salesforce. Sometimes we call it an integration user. But this idea that we have a user that's part of the system that isn't a real person, and oftentimes it's got elevated privileges, and that's what's doing a lot of these back-end tasks. Slack has the Events API, and Salesforce has Platform Events. So kind of this concept of event-driven architecture, that type of thing. Slack has a concept of a workspace, and that's kind of where you're going to build your Slack app. Ultimately, you might end up with like a multi-workspace enterprise grid or something like that, but similarly, Salesforce, a lot of companies have multiple Salesforce orgs. So you're building a Slack app in a workspace, Salesforce app in a dev org. Also, this idea of shortcuts and quick actions. So Slack uses global and message level shortcuts, and Salesforce has global quick actions and object quick actions. So I think those ideas are very similar. When you're doing a global quick action or a global shortcut, you're not in the context of a record or a message. But when you do a message shortcut or an object quick action, you're kind of in that context of do something with this message, do something with this record. And on the UI side, Slack has BlockKit and Salesforce has Lightning-based components. These are, you could say, somewhat simplified UI elements that are very easy to invoke. BlockKit is more simple than Lightning-based components. There's fewer of them and they do less things, but they also work very nicely in the mobile, desktop, web experience. So there's some benefits to simplicity. You get more of the write once and run anywhere behavior there. So some of the similarities. So don't be afraid these things you know about Salesforce also transfer to Slack. Slack does have lots of different APIs. This isn't all of them, but this is most of them. And what I wanted to highlight here was which APIs are better fits for building a Salesforce backend app for Slack. So the real-time messaging API, this is WebSocket. It's an older standard from Slack, and it doesn't support some of the new features. And like if you've written streaming things for Salesforce, you've probably come across it's using this Comet D protocol, and that's an alternative to WebSocket. WebSocket's not a good fit for Salesforce because it uses a competitive streaming method to subscribe to things. So Salesforce can't use the RTM API by itself. You'd have to have some server in the middle to even be able to use it. Similarly, socket mode is like a flavor of the web API or interactivity API. It's just running it in socket mode, so same problem there. Although it's the newer APIs, the subscription mechanism's not that compatible with Salesforce. The Slack incoming webhooks, I put this as like a yellow light there. This one can be used, but it's kind of old school and simple. I think of this as being a good mechanism for things like, Workato, Zapier, maybe more of the declarative sort of integrations. So it can be used, but as you know, webhooks are also, you could say maybe they're not as secure. It's kind of an anonymous thing that you're posting to. But they do get the job done for simple use cases. Let's say you wanted something as simple as like a new lead is created in Salesforce and you want to show that in Slack. A webhook might be a good way to achieve that. But the last two in green here, I think are best bets for building a Salesforce backend app for Slack. And so that's the Events API over HTTP, not in socket mode. This is pretty cool. And we're going to jump into a lot of code that leverages this API. But essentially, Slack is just calling your Salesforce endpoint like anytime anything happens in Slack. It's kind of like a webhook, but I don't really like to call it a webhook because it's more robust, more complicated, better security, stuff like that. And then the Slack Web API we talked about earlier, that's just similar to like the Salesforce REST API. So this allows us to talk back into Slack and do whatever we want, gets, puts, posts, deletes, things like that. So the combination of the Events API and the Web API kind of gives that round trip of listening to everything in Slack and then posting anything you want to do back into Slack. So a little bit of new terminology. We're not used to hearing terms like surfaces in the Salesforce world. But in Slack, these are very important. So surfaces are ways your app can present things to the users. And as you can see, there's not very many, right? So we've got the App Home tab, which I'll be showing you that. We've got Modals, and that's very similar to Salesforce Modal, but they pop up in Slack. Modal is very interrupting. So Slack doesn't let you call modals whenever you want. You can only make a modal pop up in Slack if a user clicks on a button or something very explicit. The user has to want the modal to open. You can't just open them whenever you want because they interrupt everything. And then messages, which don't interrupt as much. And so messages you can open up automatically whenever you want. And these messages can be simple text messages, like when users are typing back and forth, or they can be block kits. So you can actually put an inline UI, almost like a Lightning Web component, right in the message there without interrupting the user like a modal does. And actually block kit can be used at all levels. So app home, modal, messages, they can all use block kit. The other concept besides surfaces is interactivity. So this is ways systems and users can interact with the app. So a machine can do interactivity by like a scheduled job or calling the Slack APIs. Also, a human can do interactivity. And so the mechanisms they have are those shortcuts. So we'll take a look at those. But they can be a global or a message shortcut. Slash commands, maybe you're familiar, a little bit more of a power user style of a shortcut. And a block kit button click. So this is you showing a form, a modal or a message form, and the user clicks on a button. These are types of interactivity. And then we've also got these Slack events, which these aren't quite interactivity, but they're very similar. And essentially, if you think of interactivity, it's more explicit, more active. The events are more passive, more implied, or more like the system spying on you. So, instead of typing a slash command, which would be interactivity, maybe you join a channel, or maybe you type a message and there's a keyword in there. Maybe you add an emoji to something. So this is you interacting with the system, but not with the intent of the system actually listening to you or doing something, but the system still will potentially, if you've built an app to look for these things, systems still might respond with something. So this is, you kind of have passive ways and active ways of interacting with the system. The active way is called interactivity. The more passive way is just creating these events. And this is just a little visual of the difference between surfaces and interactions. So a system like Salesforce or any other system can create interactions. A person can create interactions, and then the surfaces are how it's presented back: messages, app home, things like this. Just a word about security. I'm going to show some coding things around this, but I wanted to put it in the slides. So in Salesforce, you have to expose a public site. And this can be a bit of a security issue. Thankfully, Salesforce gives you multiple mechanisms to secure this. And the first one is the URL. So instead of having, acme.salesforce.com/slack, do something where you have like a long random string as your site name so nobody can guess that thing. And in fact, we actually get 2 or 3 places to do this. You can do it at your domain name, which oftentimes you don't get the choice of because it has to be a corporate domain, but you still get the site subdirectory and that REST URL mapping. So it's almost like you get 2 long passwords, if not 3. So, if it's a dev org or something, doesn't matter so much. But for your production, get that, 30 random character site URL going, and also similar with your REST API mapping. We'll take a look at that. There's also 2 mechanisms Slack gives you to kind of secure these, essentially webhooks that come into Salesforce. So the old established way is the token verification. And this lets you know, who's calling you. And so essentially when you configure your app in Slack, you get this token. It's very simplistic. It's not like OAuth or anything. It's just a static token. And you can look for that in the header of the Slack requests and verify that, the token matches. They've also got a newer way, which is signature verification. So this not only tells you who it's coming from, but it tells you, it does essentially a hash of that request. So it tells you what, who and what. So it's kind of like a sealed tamper-resistant envelope with the whole request in there. So very secure. This is kind of what most web services with APIs are doing these days, like Twitter API and so forth. And I'll show you some code for how to do that signature verification. And then also, we've got this guest site we have to expose in Salesforce. And so, you get the guest profile, and you have to grant it enough access to things like your Apex classes, platform events, any custom objects, CRUD FLS. So just use principle of least privilege here, right? Make sure that guest user has only the access they need on that site for whatever app that you're building. And this is a diagram that I came up with. This isn't the only way to do a Salesforce Slack app, but this is a least common denominator way. If you use this architecture, you can have a single architecture that handles all of the different kind of Slack interactions, events, interactivity, /commands, shortcuts. They can all use this pattern. And I'll go through the pattern briefly here, and then we'll see a lot of code that implements this pattern. But essentially, you use something like events API, which is more passive, or these different interactions that are more active coming from the Slack app. And they're going to an Apex REST web service on a Salesforce site. Instead of doing a lot of logic here and responding right away, what we do is we fire a platform event. And there's several reasons for that. One reason is most of these APIs, they want like a 200 response right away, quickly. If it takes too long, they'll time out. Some of them don't even take any other response besides that acknowledgement, like the Events API, for example. Other ones you could do a really quick response and be done with it. But like I said, this is sort of a least common denominator pattern. This works for all. The other thing is when you fire this platform event, You get a new set of governor limits. You also get a new user context. You get that automated process user. So you kind of satisfy a few requirements by doing this pattern. Sorry there. Okay, so we fire the platform event, and then we can have a trigger on the platform event, which is what I'm going to show you. You could also do a flow. Flows can listen to platform events. So you're kind of replicating anything you do in your Slack workspace into your Salesforce org, potentially everything, or you might want to filter it down to just a subset. And you can operate on these both with code or with declarative things like flows by firing these platform events. And then what I'm going to show you in the demo is we use Apex classes to process the platform event payload. And since we can't do a call out in this trigger context, we have to fire like a future method or a queuable to ultimately put that response back into Slack. So what you have here is kind of an asynchronous or near real-time loop of Slack requests and Salesforce responses. And you'll notice a slight delay, right? You'll do something in Slack and the Slack response will happen a second later. And that's because of this sort of near real-time asynchronous loop going on. Okay, so now I'm going to go into a demo, and stick with me here, this is a lot of stuff to go through in Salesforce and in Slack, and it's going to be some bouncing back and forth and so forth too. So I've got the Salesforce org, and I talked about the site that Slack needs to talk to. So I just wanted to take a quick look at that. You're probably all familiar with this. Just to see what that looks like. And I did talk about kind of the security. So we got this site. The name of the site is this kind of random long path, right? That's part of our security. What this gives us is it gives us the ability to not have a lot of people like port scanning the internet and burning up our API calls. Even if they found this path, they're still not going to be able to do anything to our app because we're doing token verification and the signing verification, but it might jack up your API calls. So this kind of protects that. And in fact, we even take it a step further because what we're doing is calling Apex REST web services. So we also have this URL mapping, right? So you have to know the subdirectory and the URL mapping. So it's like two long passwords. And then, we have this public access settings. So this takes you to the profile for this guest user, Slack listener. And, you have to give it access to the Apex classes, the CRUD FLS, and so forth there. So I've just set up two endpoints. I've got the Slack event listener and the Slack interactivity listener on this site. So these are the only two endpoints that Slack can hit. And you don't have to divide them exactly this way. This could be all one listener. It could be two. You could make different ones. Essentially, when you go into Slack, so remember this api.slack.com.apps. This is a nice URL that takes you right to your app to configure it. And so this is where you'll tell your Slack app to talk to your Salesforce URL. So you can come down here and see different things such as the event subscriptions. And I've got this enabled, and this is that same URL that we just saw in Salesforce. There's an interesting thing here where the first time you configure these, and it's not just for events, right? It's also for things like interactivity, right? And so this is where you get to choose, do I do the same URL or different URL, right? But essentially the first time you configure these URLs, it tells you right here, we'll send an HTTP post, this URL, and we'll send a challenge parameter. And your endpoint must respond with the challenge. So you have to have some Apex code that, to even save this URL, you have to have some special Apex code that responds back to Slack so it can validate the URL. So what I've done is I've created this Slack Payloads object. Right now it's empty. And anything that comes into Salesforce on those endpoints gets saved to this object so we can look at them. So what I'm going to do is show you how that challenge works really quickly. So if we go back to here and we say we want to change this, so I'm going to just bring on my IDE here. So you got this event listener. What I'm going to do is just change this 2 to a 3, and then come over here and change this 2 to a 3 and save it. And so now we're going to essentially reauthorize this URL to a slightly different one. And when you mouse out of it, it verifies it. So what happened there? If we go back to our Slack payloads and refresh, we can see what that challenge looks like. It's pretty simple. What it does is it sends you, some headers, which we'll get more into later. But more importantly, it sends this challenge piece of data. And essentially what we do is just echo it back. So if you come in here to the event listener, and this is parsing that same payload right here. And what we do is, if the type ends up being a URL verification, essentially we just echo back out in the response body that challenge parameter. So that's that piece of the puzzle. The other thing I want to show you is when we make further requests, like we have this Slack signature, right? Version 0 equals this thing. So this is in the header of all the requests. If you look at the Slack documentation, it tells you could say in pseudocode or something, basically how to verify that signature. So they say, retrieve the timestamp, concatenate version number, timestamp, and body of the request to form a base string, something like this, right? So this actually is securing the contents of the message, like that secure envelope. It's actually incorporating what was in there, and it uses this HMAC SHA-256, which Salesforce actually has. And so essentially Slack is creating a hash. You recreate the hash from the pieces, and there's a certificate that a signing certificate, a secret that Slack has, and you can find that in the configuration here, and so it's like a kind of like a password essentially that's securing the contents of that envelope, and you can make sure if it's proper or not by comparing the two. So this is where you'll see it in the configuration. So we can actually do that in Apex, and I made my my payload object here a little more robust, so it actually shows you the calculated signature, calculated in Salesforce, and it can compare. Essentially, it can compare this one to this one, and it can tell you if it passed or not. If there's a failure, it'll tell you what the failure is. And so the code for that, which I'll make available on GitHub, it's in here. So if you look at the Slack request validator, it's doing what we just saw in that that Slack article. It's taking the timestamp, and first it's just validating is the timestamp even correct, and is it within a 5-minute window, just to make sure it's not a replay attack. If the timestamp's not even correct, it doesn't even bother to go any further. But you can see it does the concatenation, it does the hash with this crypto generate MAC, HMAC SHA-256. and it just basically sees if the two match or not. So that's that piece. The other mechanism is much more simple, and that was and I don't think it shows up in the verification, the initial request, but we'll see it when we do more requests. But the other, I think, it might be this token. But essentially, you just compare the two tokens. So, like when you're in here, you can look at your let's look at your configuration, and you can get that token, that verification token, and just compare it. So, like, this is some YK 5K. If we come over here, YK 5K. So it can at least verify that it's the correct person, but it's not, it's not like you're not assured that the payload has been tampered with. So token is like the less secure, more simple, older way to verify these requests from Slack, and signature is the more secure, newer way to do it. You could even do both if you want, but yeah. So that's basically like when you're writing your code, give it a secure URL, and also verify before you do any, querying data in Salesforce or DML or anything. First step is just to verify this request. So if we look at the code that's listening, we can see this validation response, and we do insert the payload because this could potentially help you to find people trying to hack it. But then we say, if that verification request isn't valid, we're just going to return a 401 and not go any further. Okay, so that's a bit on security, validating things in Apex, setting up our endpoints that Salesforce can listen to. But we have a whole host of things that could potentially happen in Slack that we're listening to in Salesforce. And in fact, like, I can show you that. Like, if we come into Slack, there's different ways to view this, but the newer way is with this app manifest. This is kind of a one-stop shop for configuration. I mean, look at all these things we're listening to in Slack, right? If any of these things happen, it's potentially creating an event in Salesforce. And so, how do we funnel all that stuff into Salesforce and handle it properly? Well, there's a funneling aspect. There's also a filtering aspect, routing, this kind of thing. So you can see there's two, and Slack actually uses this terminology, outer event and inner event. So there's two different outer event types coming into the event listener. One's the URL verification, which is that thing that only happens the first time you set it up. The other one is the event callback, which could have potentially, dozens of different types of events in Slack. So when that one happens, that's the more interesting one. What do we do? Well, what I'm doing here is some filtering. I'm saying, of the dozens of events in Salesforce, let's only handle these. And you can disguise the limit with how you configure these. Like, you could make this a custom metadata type or database object or something, but I just hard coded them right here. So what happens when this subset of events happens? Somebody joins or leaves a channel, they write a message, they add or remove an emoji, or they open the app home tab in Slack. Well, what it's going to do is it's going to publish a platform event. And since this is the event listener, we're publishing what we call a Slack event. So Slack events happen in Slack, then this makes them also happen in Salesforce. And we've got the structure we use is an event type. This is like structured data, and then a payload, which is unstructured. So this will be like the string of the event type, like reaction added. But then the body is a big JSON structure that could be very different depending on the type of event. So that's what we do when an event happens. We also have other events, like let's say you do a slash command, which isn't like that passive event, it's more of the active event. We have the Interactivity Listener that will find that. So it's a similar listener. It's just I decided to divide mine and with the passive events and the active, button clicks and shortcuts and things. But you could make them on the same class if you want. The structures are different, which is why I put them in different classes. The way you parse the messages are different. But if it's an interactivity, it's doing a similar thing, and it's posting different types of events. So a block action event is totally freeform. This could be an array of buttons that you click or anything. So all it has is a body. If it's in a block action, would be like an action you're performing on a block kit form. So this would be like a Lightning Web Component in Salesforce. You can imagine the way you interact with a Lightning Web Component, it's going to be totally different. So we just put that into a single payload field. Whereas a slash command is a little more structured, right? You've actually got the name of the slash command. So we've defined one called Dynamodal, which is a dynamically created modal that I'll show to you in Slack. If you do that slash command, it's going to publish a platform event in Salesforce called Slack/command with the name of the slash command and then that unstructured body, which would be things like the important thing are the parameters that you put after it, but it also contains a whole JSON structure of like what user did it and these types of things. And then shortcuts are kind of similar to the slash command, right? You've got a shortcut name, and this one here is a global, and this one is a message context shortcut. So the structure is very similar. It's just the payload for the message shortcut will tell you like what was the message that the shortcut was acted on, that kind of thing. And so the way we configure these other things, slash commands and shortcuts, that's back over to our Slack setup. So if you go to like interactivity and shortcuts, there's that listener URL. Here's those two shortcuts I've defined. And the slash commands, I've configured one. It's under here. So that kind of gives you a feel for the Apex we set up, the setup in Salesforce versus how we configure these things in Slack to talk back to Salesforce. So I think what I'll do next is just show you some of these examples. So I've got a lot of stuff running in this Slack org that I'm going to show you. So if you look at the event listener, look at this message, right? So message, like a lot of things can happen with message because it's unstructured data. You can be typing, you could have all kinds of bots running on top of message, right? Anytime a message is typed. So our code that is listening for those messages, right? We have a trigger, and it's if we open this thing up, it's an after insert, right? Because this is a platform event trigger, and so anytime a message comes in, we're firing a platform event. There's a trigger on the platform event, and there's the Slack event handler, handle Slack events. So if we look at that, we can see there's this handle message. So anytime a message is typed in Slack, we're actually doing three things. One thing we're doing in the Slack service is we're agreeing with everything the user says. So anytime I type a message in Slack, this bot, let's type something. This bot that agrees with anything is going to reply to this message. And it's kind of a dev org, I think, so it's a little bit slow. Maybe it's waking up still. But come back here and see if it even got the... So let's, back to our payloads. Let's see if these things even came in. Yeah, they didn't come in. So I'm not sure what's going on here. This is a good opportunity to talk about debugging now. So, how do you debug these things? So you can actually do a debug log on the guest site user. And if we look at the timestamps, I think it's expired. So I'm going to delete these old ones. And I don't know, that's probably enough deleting. And we can come back to this particular user here. And we can just bump this time up to like, I don't know, 8 o'clock. And then I can come back here, send a message. And then come back here and we can see, did we capture some problem? So we have a problem here. If we look, let's see, that was earlier. So yeah, actually, if you look at these timestamps, this is showing it's not even getting to Slack. So let's go back to our Slack configuration and our events. And so this is on. I'm just wondering if maybe when I was showing you the verification, if I broke something. So if we go back to our event listener, and it shouldn't matter what this is, but I'll just put it back to 2. And then we'll change this. There's also something you have to do sometimes. Let's see, it's verified. You have to sometimes publish your changes to the org. I'm not sure why it's not showing the Save Changes button, but if you look at this Install App, sometimes you have to do this reinstall to workspace. And then you'll see, like, back over here, it'll post this message. So see if that fixed it. There we go. So this is that first piece. Anytime we say anything, we have a bot that's going to agree with it. So it's kind of boring, but this is sort of the most basic bot interaction you can create in Salesforce, is to reply to a message without even caring what the message says. And it'll just reply the same thing every time. So I want to show you the code for that, but I also want to show you the payloads here. So if we refresh, we can kind of start seeing all these messages. And you can see these are these inner events are messages, outer event callbacks. So we're kind of parsing out this JSON just so we can look at some interesting stuff in this payload. So we've got the headers, but more importantly, we've got the body. So you can kind of see the structure of the Slack API events as they come into Salesforce. There's my text, any message. And you can see things like, my user ID and things like that. So that's what those look like. And then in terms of the code for doing that, we were looking at the Slack event handler. And I just created a service class handling a lot of the heavy lifting for this stuff, like creating messages, creating block kit, things like that. So the agree with everything is kind of a utility method I created that takes the bot's user ID and the message you want to agree with. And the reason for that is we have to know that message ID to reply to. So if we go into the Slack service, we can see that code for that. That one's pretty simple. Agree with everything. It's making sure the message user is not the bot user ID, and that's because it will create an infinite loop of the bot replying to itself saying, I totally agree. It totally agrees with itself totally agreeing. So you have to make sure the message user isn't the bot user. And then I've got another class where I put all the methods that call the Slack web API directly. So remember that big loop? We get the message from Slack into Salesforce. We fire the platform event. We fire the future method. We call the Slack web API. So that's what this is. And if we look at Slack web API, so I've got all these building blocks, right? Because we don't want to repeat the code anywhere. So we've got the ability, like any of the service classes can call the singular post message, either with text or with a block kit form. And essentially what this is doing is it's just making a map of all the body parameters we're going to post and just turning them to JSON. And then down at the bottom, we do the actual HTTP call out. So that's all this is doing. It's just like you'd call the Salesforce REST API. This is calling the Slack REST API. And it's putting that bot token in for authentication. And whatever parameters that particular API needs, you can see I just put like the documentation and so forth in here if you wanted to see more about the API. So like this messaging one, if you want to see more about it. And so this is how we're using the Slack API with Apex to basically agree with everything. So that's a simple one. If we go back to our code and we look at this Slack event handler, we're actually, anytime a message comes into Salesforce, we're doing three things potentially. We're agreeing with everything. We're also doing this Benioff reaction, which is like looking for the keyword Benioff in your message. And if you say the keyword Benioff, it's gonna use the cloud emoji to react. And then we have a more complicated one. If you use the word block kit, it's actually going to show you a block kit form. So we'll take a look at both of those. The Benioff reaction, if the message text in any case contains Benioff, react with a cloud emoji. And this is how you do emojis in Slack. It's by emoji name. So you can Google for that. It has like all the names of all the emojis. And then the other one, so I'll show you this one, then we'll look at the other one. So if you say something like, Mark Benioff is the best, you're going to get two things happening. You're going to get the agree with everything bot replying to this thing. I totally agree. And then we should be getting their reaction there too. Yeah, so we get the cloud reaction. And then the last one is a little more complicated. So the last one is this block kit reaction. So if the text contains the word block kit, it's going to actually create a block kit UI. So you can see there's a lot of code in this one, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run it first, and then I'm going to dive into the code. So if we say like, I want to see some block kit, So we get, first of all, we get our reply to everything. And then we get this block kit. I'm not sure why it showed up twice. Doesn't matter too much, but what we've got here, we've got text, we've got some markdown, like bolding things. We've got emojis, we've got an image, and we've got 2 buttons. So, and we can even click these buttons and do things, right? So, if I click that guy as tops, Slack is sending an interactivity message back to Salesforce with that interactivity listener. And if we click I'm not impressed, it's also doing it. And it's running a little slow today. I think in a production org it runs a lot faster. But okay, so that's kind of what it does. Let's look at the code. So this is where I want to start introducing the concept of block kit to you. It's got some similarities and some differences to Lightning Web Components. So let's just look at what Slack has to say about it, right? So Slack is showing you some of the things you can do, buttons, select menus, multi-select, right? So this kind of feels like base components a little bit. The big difference is the way you define this stuff is with JSON, right? This is not, Lightning Web Components is like kind of like XML tags. This is JSON. So it's something new to get used to. But thankfully, they give you this block kit builder, and it lets you preview your block kit as a message, as a modal, as an app home tab. And also, if it's a message or a modal, you can see it on mobile. So it lets you do that. It also lets you pick block kit items here, and then over here see the JSON. So it's you're not just writing JSON by typing it. It's more of a WYSIWYG. If anybody's really old school, this is kind of how we used to do like websites with Dreamweaver and things like that. But if I'm to click on one of these things, it's going to put it at the bottom here. And then if I scroll down here, I can see the JSON for it. So it gives you some hand-holding for building these UIs, which is pretty cool. So if you're a Salesforce developer and you've worked with JSON, you probably think, well, I can make Apex objects and I can serialize them to kind of build these block kits. So that's what I've done. When we were looking at this example here, that's how I built this block kit, was with Apex. So if you see right here, we're doing things like creating a Slack block kit section called header section. And this thing has the text, did someone ask to see block kit, right? So here is our block kit header section. And then as we get into this more, here's our emojis. And then we add this thing called an accessory with a type image. And that's how we got the image in there, right? So I'm building up this JSON by building up this Apex object, even the buttons, and ultimately serializing it. So, I've obviously got this class called Slack block kit. And if we come in here, I've got a view, I've got a layout, divider, section. Remember that accessory image? Here it is. So you can create these Apex objects, button, and so forth that mirror the block kit JSON. You can serialize them and deserialize them. That's a nice way to work with block kit forms. There's yet another way, and this way is cool because it can be dynamic, right? In fact, I've created this slash command called dynamodal, right? So you can do like, you can loop in Apex and create as many sections as you want. So I'm going to say 50. And I've got Apex code that's iterating through and creating this modal. I have to give it a second, but I'm going to pop over here and show you what that looks like. So if we go to the Slack service, and if you see this create dynamodal block, it can iterate through and add as many Apex sections as you want. And then we open that view over here. Maybe 50 was too big for it, I don't know. So, I typed 20 on my slash command. It created these 20 sections in Apex and then ultimately deserialized that to the blockkit JSON and showed the modal like that. So there's another way I want to show that you can create blockkit, which I think is instead of being dynamic, it's more static. It's very similar to a email template. So I created a custom object called a Slack blockkit template. And what we have here is we just stick all the JSON right in this database record, right? But we're using merge fields like an email template. So like in your Apex, you can merge that thing. So if you don't need a dynamic length blockkit form, you can create them as these almost email templates where they're more static, but you can still do merge fields. So you can see right here, we're merging that price field with a value 210. And one thing, if you haven't gotten it already, right, these Slack UIs that we're seeing, they don't live in Slack. These are being published in real time from Salesforce. So I think that's kind of a different concept to get through. But here's that UI right here. So you can see this thing, like if I click off and then I go back here, it actually loaded this in real time. And if you don't believe me, we can come in here and we can actually edit this thing, and you can see that. So Windsor Court Hotel 2, and we'll save it. And then we'll come back here and we'll click off and we'll click back on. See, there's the 2. So this UI, even though it's in Slack, it's actually coming from this database record. But obviously it's kind of nasty to have to maintain this JSON. So the cool thing is I just created a little Lightning Web component here. This actually loads that JSON into the blockkit builder, right? So now we're back to here. We can see the WYSIWYG style thing, and let's say we wanted to put in like a time picker at the bottom. Now we can see this time picker at the bottom, and you could take your JSON here and go back into this record and kind of update the JSON. And then when we come back over here and go back to our home tab, we can see we now have the time picker there. So, 2 different ways of creating blockkit UIs. Also 2 different surfaces, right? I'm showing you the static one shown through the home tab surface, as well as the dynamic one, which I was showing through like a messaging surface. So yeah, you can see when you click the buttons here, that was another interactivity listener, very similar to like doing a slash command or anything else. So let me see. I'm getting low on time. I want to make sure I show you all the important things though. Yeah, I think what I want to show you next, I've got a lot to show you, but these are 2 really important things I want to get across. So the idea of a global shortcut versus a message shortcut. So similarly, I said to like quick actions, right? So if you click here, you can see your global shortcuts. And we've got this one that we created. I showed you the configuration for it earlier in the Slack setup. Remember, there was 2. So This one is not in the context of any message. It's like a utility bar in Salesforce or a global action. I just want to see how many leads are in Salesforce. Doesn't matter where I am. So that thing runs and it says 22 leads in Salesforce. Code for that, I'll show you quickly. So that thing, if I'm going to close all these, if we look at the Interactivity Listener and how this routes, right? It's publishing this, lead count is one of the allowed, that's the one we just ran, that global shortcut. It's going to publish it. We're going to listen for that here with this platform event, and it's got a shortcut handler. And if we look into the shortcut handler, it ultimately routes us to this lead count. It's just doing a straight query out of Salesforce, and it's using the Apex style of creating block kit, right? So we have that Apex object where we create a section, section 1, and ultimately we add it to a modal, and we open that modal with our Slack web API, call out method. And so that's how we generated that. The other one we do is a message shortcut. So this one is in the context of a message, and this shows up somewhere totally different. So I can type like Apex hours, and when I go here to these 3 dots, right, I get more actions. This is where you're going to see your message level shortcut. So I'm going to say for this message, invoke the shortcut to convert this thing to lead. This is like old school kind of hacker talk. And I've actually upgraded this thing to a 2.0 version. So you can see we've got 2 replies now. So this is doing like block letter style, right? So I said Apex hours, the message action, converted that message Apex hours to these kind of like old school ASCII block letters like you might see on like, I don't know, some old hacking forum or something like that. So, how do we do that? Well, what we did is we just took the original text and we translated it here. And that's exactly what we're seeing here, right? Original text, Apex hours, elite speak, you noob. So translating is like elite speak, you newbie. And then we dump out the text. And if you want to see that, I've just got this translator class where I've mapped every letter and number to like a block letter. That's how that's doing it. So. Okay, so all the while we've been doing this, we've also been monitoring these payloads too, right? So that's kind of interesting to come back and take a look at some of these. Quite a few. So you can see these inner events, the message, the lead speak. Remember the lead count? So if we were to look at, lead count, a global shortcut, what that payload looks like, it doesn't really have, it has a little bit of context, like it says it's a shortcut, it says the domain I'm on, but it doesn't have any message info, right? Because it was a global one. But if I was to go back and look at, the outer event message action versus this shortcut is what they call it in the API. This one actually has the message. So the message was Apex hours, right? It's got more context. So the other thing I want to mention quickly, back to the slides. I'll just do this style. So Salesforce is actually building a lot of this stuff. You probably heard at some of the conferences, they mentioned Foyer. So this is going to give you a lot of this stuff more natively. So you don't have to write a lot of the Apex. So this will give you this authorization, user mapping, org routing, as well as this thing that's sort of code name UISF, so UI Services Framework, which is going to give some block kit generation in Apex. I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like, if it's going to look like the dynamic version or the static version or what. Probably the dynamic one if I had to guess. So this stuff's coming. So what I've showed you is kind of how to fill the gap until it comes, but also how to understand it, right? Because if they're just giving you a black box, it's nice to know how that thing works under the hood when you get unexpected results. But also, as you know, we have to extend things often, right? So they might give us Foyer and UISF, but we may still have to build like a custom layer on top of it to extend it, something like that. So keep in mind, right, I'm showing you things, but this is also going to come more natively, but we still may have to use both. And I also wanted to mention a word about this authorization piece. So we've got the bot, right, in Slack, and we're kind of doing everything in the context of that bot in terms of the access it has to Slack. But we could also do OAuth, and you could actually do things in the context of any user in Slack. So if we wanted to like post messages that didn't say they were from the Salesforce app, but they were from me, we can do that also. We just put the user's token in the authorization instead of the bot's token. I don't think those use cases are as common, but it is doable. And if we were going to do that, we would have to store, access token, refresh token in Salesforce for every user, and they'd have to do an OAuth flow to be able to use the app. The other thing is the reverse, right? So we're running all this stuff under the context of guest site user automated process, but we could store an access token, refresh token for Salesforce in Salesforce, or you just do some filtering like user mapping. So you could say Daniel Peter in Slack, you could add his user ID to like the Daniel Peter record for the user in Slack. I'm sorry, in Salesforce. And then if I did the lead count or something, I could say, it's a little bit like building your own security, so you have to be careful. But you could say like, count the leads where owner ID equals this Slack's user ID on the user record kind of thing. So you can do some filtering that way based on the connecting the Slack user to the Salesforce user. That's like a lightweight filtering. It's not like a robust OAuth, but yes. But I think more commonly you'll see these use cases are just going to use like the bot user context or the system user context. But if you do hit a use case where you need actual user context, you can do it both in Slack and in Salesforce. And I can just take a quick look to make sure there's nothing else in this code that I wanted to show you. I can show you the block action handler quickly. Remember when I clicked these two buttons? If I said like, this guy is tops versus I'm not impressed, how does that stuff work? So that's just another handler here where I'm looking for, it's essentially like an ID of that button. And I can say handle click tops or handle click worse, and it's just posting a message. And I think everything else here I showed you. So it took a little over an hour. Sorry about that, but if we have enough time, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Daniel. There are a lot of great information. So there is a question into the chat window. Is this possible to extract data from the Salesforce and return CSV to user in Slack?
Yeah. A CSV. Yeah, so there is API for attachments. Let's take a look at that. I'm pretty sure we can do this. I'll just Google. Yes, Slack is very limited, right? We've got like the UI, we can't do as much. We can't post like a lot of fancy UIs. And actually, one of the tricks people use are they create an image of the fancy UI and return the image, because you can return images. But one of the things we can do are attachments, right? If you've used Slack, we know we do file attachments. So, yeah, so here's the code to create a message with an attachment. And I guess in this case, the attachment is an image. But yeah, I'm like 98% sure we could do that. I did show an example of, querying. So, if we saw we queried the count of leads. So that was in the Slack service. And we also queried the block kit came from a database record too. So we can definitely query data in Salesforce. We can definitely create attachments via Slack API. The thing that might worry me is like governor limits, things like that. So I would say, while I'm 98% sure, there's that small chance, and this is where you can't use a Salesforce app to do everything. Sometimes we have to do something like go to Heroku or AWS to like create a big file or something like that. So, because the heap in Apex is kind of limited. And definitely if you're going to create an image, you're going to need something like, if the attachment is an image, like CSV is text, right? So we can kind of do that in Apex. There's like CSV generators in Apex and so forth. But they do have governor limits. But if you're going to do something like create an image, you probably, right out of the gate, you're not going to probably be able to do that. If it's a dynamically created image, you're going to have to use like a Heroku or AWS as part of the puzzle. What else can we have? Multi-step, back and forth. Yes, so definitely. I showed it a little bit. It's pretty simplistic, but this was a message block kit, and when we click this, it responded. We could have had this thing respond with another block kit message, or if you're doing modals, there's some fancy interactions in modals. I didn't go into it just because I don't have enough time, but if you Google Slack and you start looking into these block elements and interactive components, you can do some fancier things within modals to kind of do a more dynamic UI or like a wizard style thing. And I see is the code currently accessible in a repo, so no, but I will post it today after this talk, and this is the address where I'll put it. So if, I don't know, well, I can paste this into the chat, and then you won't have to type it. So I'll put that there. Pondering the possibility to use Slack for customer support. Yeah, so that's one of the most common use cases. They call it maybe ticket swarming, case swarming, and I think it's amazing for that. So yeah, you might do something like in Salesforce, pretend this was a case. You might put a button here that says, case swarm to Slack. And then it would create, actually, I didn't show this, but you can also create channels via API. So it would create a channel with the case number, and you would potentially ping people, like ask around, because like that's where Slack is amazing. When you don't know who to ask, you can ask the top level manager, and they'll ask the next manager, and you'll eventually find that perfect person to collaborate on the case. You'll get an answer in Slack. And then remember, we saw the ability to do like a message. So you might see a message shortcut that says, add as case resolution. And then it puts it back in that particular message that resolves it. It could update the case, and give the text field for resolution right from Slack, and then maybe you would even store the whole Slack message stream back into the case. So yeah, I think it's a perfect use case for case swarming.
Thank you, Daniel. You mentioned add as case resolution. Is that the out of box, or we need to do some development?
I think there's both options. This is such a popular use case that there's some out of the box solutions for this. I don't know like what stage of general availability they're in though. You know, it's the kind of thing where they announce it at Dreamforce, but only certain customers have it. But then there's also these third parties. So if you take a look at the App Exchange and you search for Slack, or the Slack app directory and you search for Salesforce, you'll see a lot of these out of the box solutions that do things like case swarming. So you could, if they meet your needs, you could do that. Or if they don't and you have a very custom workflow, you can use these Apex techniques that I'm showing you to build custom things. There's also, right, like I said at the beginning, we created Workflow Builder. So I didn't show that today, and that's also part of a paid Slack account, whereas this can be used with a free Slack account. But Workflow Builder can handle a lot of these use cases also.
Thank you, Daniel. I will find out. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, this is what are the steps for setting up the Salesforce Slack connection? So yeah, we've got both of these systems talking to each other. Um, you know, I think what the question is asking is, are these types of questions? So, um, you know, we've got our our tokens for the bot, which is kind of like our authentication, but we've also got so that's how we talk back into Slack. But we've also got these things like, you know, basically, I would recommend like going to api.slack.com, apps, create an app, and just go through every single one of these because there's not very many. But like the ones I showed, like slash commands. Actually, that one was under interactivity. The slash commands also post to interactivity. But I mean, so this is what we do. We talk to, this is the Salesforce connection, I guess you would say. There's no, there's not exactly like an OAuth token that comes into Salesforce, but remember there's the verification token and then the signature. So we can verify that these things are from Slack cryptographically, so it's pretty secure. Then the other direction, right, to talk to Slack, in order to do that from Salesforce, that's where, you know, this thing comes in, and basically we're just posting to the Slack endpoint, which is, you know, slack.com/API with our authorization bot token in the header, and the header comes, you know, from this configuration. We have the token in here, so the connections are fairly simple, both directions. So you do want to be careful that you take the precautions like validate the requests are actually from Slack and things like that.
Daniel,
Yeah,
I have a
so
question.
yeah,
If we use Slack for support,
yeah.
suppose we are a technical company. So when we talk with customers, we use Markdown to show code to send code to each other. Would Slack be able to support Markdown, for example?
Yeah, so I think there's two answers there. So they do support, I would say, their own proprietary limited version of Markdown. So you can do some bolding and so forth. But when you said um, code samples, so if you look at this Slack service here, I'm actually doing something in here that Maybe actually it's not in Slack service. It's in the Interactivity Listener, or I'm going to actually search for it. So triple tick mark is your key for if you're writing integrations or even within Slack and you've got a multi-line code comment block. If you use these triple tick marks, then it puts it, see how this is kind of wrapped in this like background? This is actually a code block. So I guess another thing we could do is let's just grab this code and show you what it looked like with code instead of with the mono-spaced font, right? So, you can do this and you get the code block, but you've also got this code block right here. You can just click it. So you can generate these types of code blocks from Salesforce via code, via their API by using this triple tick mark, basically start and end, wrapping it in those.
That's cool. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this pretty exciting new capabilities, I think, for Salesforce developers. Hopefully, your heads are starting to spin with ideas, and I kind of just scratched the surface. Like I just showed you some of the basic APIs. There's a lot more to the Slack APIs, and things you can do. But the benefits are like kind of, if you're already using Slack and Salesforce, Slack is a bit like a supercharger on top of Salesforce. So you can make a lot of these use cases that take a long time to like go into Salesforce and refresh a list view and read some records and run a report and do all this stuff. Like you can, if those can be automated and pushed into Slack, you can put any data from Salesforce in here. You can have any interactions back and forth. You can involve people. These types of things. You're always going to have to use Salesforce as a system of record, and for really, thick work, you're going to have to go into Salesforce. But for the thin work, for the quick things, they can just say, hey, do you approve this? Or, hey, this new thing came in. Do you want to escalate it or close it? Like these types of things. If you can automate those into Slack, your employees and your company can get the easy stuff done really quickly that way. So I think there's a ton of exciting new use cases for companies already using Slack and Salesforce. And the other thing is, I created the Salesforce app. You don't have to just use Salesforce as a backend. You can also have other custom apps that are built on AWS or they're downloaded from the app directory, right? So don't think of like Salesforce as a mutually exclusive option. It can be one of many options. And so maybe you have your Salesforce app where it makes sense, but you also have your AWS app that could even be talking to Salesforce if need be for like the really fancy things like generating binary files like images, or doing some AI or things that maybe Salesforce doesn't do as well.
Okay, that's great. Let me stop the recording.